you've tried the carrots, so now we have to go to sticks. And he's alluded to sanctions, he's alluded to tariffs, he's alluded to other things. I hope he would also include increased military support for Ukraine as being a really effective and the most effective stick that you can actually use against the Russians, even more so than tariffs and economic tools. But yes, the Russians are at this point. I think they're running out of maneuvering space.
Well, there's perhaps a similar situation in the air. Russia seemingly paused their air attacks yesterday. I think that's the first time in months where there haven't been strikes overnight. How should we read into that?
I wouldn't read into it at all very deeply, to be honest. I mean, just over the last weekend, Saturday night, there was a massive ballistic missile and air launched missile and drone attack against Kyiv. The Russians, of course, continue to strike Ukrainian energy infrastructure, even though in principle they said they've agreed to it. But the reality is there is no actual agreement yet, because there's no joint text published. And in fact, the Russians were hitting electrical infrastructure in Kherson, not with cruise missiles or with drones, but with tube artillery with a range of 25 kilometers. And they claim that that doesn't violate the terms of the ceasefire, because apparently the ceasefire is just for drones and missiles. And of course, the Ukrainians are still saying, well, we're still working out the details of it. And it seems to me that you're violating the spirit of the energy ceasefire if you're saying, well, technically we can still strike it with artillery because it only, the contours of the agreement only pertain to drones and long range missiles. So in reality, there is no such actual robust ceasefire. And then the Black Sea ceasefire just straight up doesn't exist. The Kremlin communique that they published explicitly states that they seek a preliminary American sanctions relief on Russian agricultural entities before that ceasefire can go into place. So there is no ceasefire, and they decisively reject the actual place where the 90% of the fighting is happening, the land warfare domain, which Putin just straight up rejected.
And I wanted to come on to some of the ceasefire and what's actually going on the ground compared to what is supposedly being agreed in these talks. As you say, the Black Sea is still being used, at least aerially, to launch attacks on Ukraine. Russia haven't actually officially agreed to any ceasefires, but the interesting thing is they're still using the ceasefire as a way of berating Ukraine on the world stage for having launched strikes into Russia. I mean, is there any signs that as well is shifting the dial on peace talks? This Russian attempt to cast Ukraine as being the ones who are violating the ceasefire.
There's some very interesting dynamics that are happening. So the Russians are in the business of narrative creation and narrative promulgation, and the narrative they're trying to hit the world with now is reasonable Russians who are open to negotiation and who are open to ceasefires, and unreasonable, dastardly Ukrainians who are passionate and hot-headed and really just like not good negotiators, or not good faith negotiators. That is, and the reality of the kinetic activity is actually that the Russians continue to strike the Ukrainians. They have in fact rejected the land warfare ceasefire, and so there's a dissonance between what the desired narrative the Russians seek to create is, and then what the Russians' actions are. And this is actually having an impact on the negotiations. In recent days, President Donald Trump has been making posts on Truth Media. Maybe not posts. He made a post on Truth Media. There's been some reports that have been done by American media about how senior American officials are increasingly frustrated, how the president is increasingly frustrated with President President Vladimir Putin for not actually abiding by the spirit of the ceasefire, by Putin dragging his feet, and because Putin's actions are making, we have to thank Putin. Putin is being Putin. He is dragging his feet, and he is not demonstrating with his actions that he actually seeks a ceasefire, that he actually wants to have some sort of peaceful negotiated settlement. Putin's actions that in fact dictate that and indicate that he wants to keep warfighting. And I think this is bringing President Trump into a sort of come to Jesus moment where he has to reconcile and understand that actually, okay, I've done this journey of discovery. I put my best foot forward. I have twisted the Ukrainians' arm very publicly. I've gotten the Ukrainians to agree to some concessions. And now the Russians are the ones that are intransigent about their objectives. And that will, and I think is imposing a decision point on President Trump on how to deal with the Russians moving forward. We've tried the carrots, so now we have to go to sticks. And he's alluded to sanctions, he's alluded to tariffs, he's alluded to other things. I hope he would also include increased military support for Ukraine as being a really effective and the most effective stick that you can actually use against the Russians, even more so than tariffs and economic tools. But yes, the Russians are at this point. I think they're running out of maneuvering space.
Well, we talk about actions versus words there. I mean, the Americans are now, there are now reports from NBC News that the Americans are now considering withdrawing 10,000 troops from Eastern Europe. Uh, that as a message for the Russians surely makes them think that they're still walking away with all the carrots and none of the stick.
I'll believe it when I see it. There's been discussion and talks about American force restructuring on NATO's eastern flank. There's been talks about sending forces from Poland to Hungary and other things, and I'm not sure. I mean, I see it all as speculation. Evaluating a plan and analyzing the ramifications of the plan is not the same thing as a principal decision maker has made a president's made a decision on how to do this. We shall see. Any sort of a major U.S. force reduction in Europe would be a massive strategic mistake. It would not enhance our ability to achieve the president's stated objectives of having a robust, secure settlement to the war in Ukraine that is not a temporary ceasefire, that is not the Minsk Accords version 3, that actually does result with permanent, robust peace and withdrawing American troops from the already anemic American force posture in Europe. That would be a mistake and not help advance those stated objectives.
Just to finish, George, US Foreign Secretary Marco Rubio has said that they will know in weeks whether the Kremlin is serious about ceasefire talks. What signs do you think they're going to be watching for the Russians? And is there anything we should look out for, be it on the ground or in some of what Russia says, that might indicate they are actually going to come to the table?
I would love to be a wall or a fly on the wall of those discussions that the Americans have been having with the Russians and Saudi Arabia. Look, the key thing I think is going to be the land domain war ceasefire. President Trump says he wants the killing to stop. Most of the killing happens on the land warfare domain. The proposal that President Trump put forward with the Ukrainians jointly is very straightforward. It's very simple. So the Russian rejection, I think, is therefore very clear. I think if we can't, that is, I think, the key thing that they're going to keep pushing for. If we're going for the temporary objectives now of the energy strike ceasefire and the Black Sea strike ceasefire. And I think if the Russians are not willing to be able to work with the Ukrainians and negotiate directly with the Ukrainians to hammer out the details, like the actual fine print details of the energy ceasefire, things like you can't hit energy ceasefire with tube artillery on the ground in addition to drones and missiles, then that's going to be it. Now, the Russians refuse to talk to the Ukrainians directly because the Russians don't see the Ukrainians as being a legitimate state. They say Zelensky's illegitimate and a variety of other things. And I think the president would like to have the Russians talk to the Ukrainians and negotiate something with the Ukrainians, but the Russians aren't willing to do that. And the premise is Ukraine's a fake country; they're not really real. It should all be Russia. We were correcting mistakes on the map that never really should have been due to historical errors and bureaucratic blunders and stuff. Then that will send a pretty clear message, I think, to the administration. They realize, like, okay, it is indeed the fact that the Kremlin is not interested in there being some entity on the map at the end of all this called Ukraine that they don't get to control. Now, I would argue that much has been very obvious and clear from the beginning, but they want to discover it for themselves. And in principle, that's fine.
Well, George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course, Louis. Always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.